Thanksgiving was supposed to be a big step for Jake and me. We had been dating for a year, and meeting his family felt like a natural progression. I'm 20, and he's 22, young, but serious enough that meeting his parents and extended family wasn't out of the blue. Still, I couldn't shake the nerves as we drove to their house. Jake had this easygoing way about him, always laughing things off, which I sometimes envied but occasionally found frustrating. On the drive over, I told him I was nervous. He laughed, saying, "Don't worry, they'll love you. Just be ready for some old-school vibes." I asked him what he meant by that, but he just smirked and said, "You'll see." That didn't exactly calm me down, but I tried to brush it off. Jake had a habit of not taking things too seriously, which could be annoying but wasn't a deal-breaker. At least, not yet. As we pulled up to his parents' house, I took a deep breath. The place was picturesque, the kind of house you'd see in a holiday movie. A large porch wrapped around the front, and the yard was decorated with little touches of fall. Pumpkins, hay bales, and a wreath of autumn leaves on the door. Inside, the smell of roasted turkey and freshly baked pies wafted out. It was warm and inviting, and Jake's confidence helped ease my tension a little. I grabbed the dish I'd brought to share and followed Jake to the door. As we stepped inside, a dozen smiling faces turned toward us. Jake beamed and introduced me to everyone in a flurry of names I knew I'd struggle to remember. For the moment, I thought I might just survive the night after all. Stepping into Jake's family home was like walking into a scene from a classic holiday painting. The warmth of the house was undeniable, but it was also slightly overwhelming. His parents greeted me with bright smiles. His mom pulled me into a tight hug almost immediately, while his dad gave a firm handshake that lingered just a little too long. Around the room, aunts, uncles, and cousins filled the space with chatter and laughter. The sound of clinking dishes came from the kitchen, and the scent of sage and roasted vegetables was everywhere. Jake seemed completely at ease, effortlessly navigating through the crowd, introducing me to his relatives one by one. I nodded, smiled, and tried to keep up, though my nerves made it hard to focus. Everyone was polite, even welcoming, but there was a formality to it all. Most of them addressed each other in a way that felt almost old-fashioned. Titles like Mr. and Mrs. slipped into the conversation, even between family members, and a few of the women wore pearls that gleamed under the chandelier light. As I took it all in, I couldn't help but feel a little out of place. My family's gatherings were much more casual, loud, messy, and full of kids running around. Here, everything seemed coordinated and precise, down to the table settings with embroidered napkins and handwritten name cards. I glanced at Jake, who winked at me as if to say, "Told you so." We settled into the living room, where everyone was sharing stories about Thanksgivings past. Jake's grandma, a tiny woman with piercing eyes, peppered me with questions about where I grew up, what I was studying, and what my family did for a living. Her tone wasn't unkind, but it was sharp enough to put me on edge. Through it all, Jake seemed oblivious, lounging back in his chair like this was the most natural thing in the world. I, on the other hand, felt like I was under a microscope, trying to answer politely while wishing I could fade into the background. Dinner started out fine. The table was beautifully set, with a golden roasted turkey at the center, surrounded by all the classic sides: mashed potatoes, green beans, cranberry sauce. Everyone seemed eager to dig in, and the conversation flowed easily at first. I was starting to relax. Maybe Jake was right, and I was overthinking things. His mom, who had seemed a bit intense earlier, was now smiling warmly as she passed the gravy boat my way. We were halfway through the meal when Jake suddenly clinked his fork against his glass. The room quieted instantly, all eyes turning to him. He had this mischievous grin on his face, one I'd seen a million times before, but never in a context like this. My stomach dropped. "Hey, everyone," Jake began, his voice carrying just the right mix of confidence and excitement. "We have big news to share." I froze. What news? I glanced at him, my heart pounding, trying to figure out what he was talking about. He turned to me with a knowing smile, the kind that usually meant he was about to do something dumb but thought it was hilarious. "Tell them, babe," he said, nudging my arm. I could feel the weight of the room on me. His mom was already dabbing at her eyes with a napkin, looking emotional. Someone whispered, "Are they getting engaged?" Jake didn't give me a chance to answer. Instead, he leaned forward, beaming at his audience. "She's pregnant!" The room erupted. Gasps, cheers, a sharp intake of breath from his grandma. Meanwhile, I sat there, stunned. My brain couldn't catch up with what had just happened. "No, I'm not!" I blurted out, my voice almost drowned out by the commotion. Jake just laughed, shaking his head. "Come on, babe, play along, it's just a joke." But no one was laughing, least of all me. The weight of his words hung in the air as I stared at him, speechless. While chaos began to unfold around us, Jake's words hung in the air, echoing louder with every passing second. "She's pregnant." It was like the world had frozen for a moment, except for the chaos unraveling around me. His mom's face went pale, and her hands clutched the tablecloth for support. Someone gasped audibly. Jake's dad leaned forward, his brows furrowed as if trying to process the news. Across the table, Jake's grandmother clasped her hands together and began whispering what sounded like a prayer under her breath. Meanwhile, I sat in stunned silence, my brain scrambling to make sense of the situation. My first instinct was to deny it, to yell, "No, I'm not. He's joking." But before I could get a word out, his mom let out a small cry and collapsed against her chair. "Mom!" Jake's older sister shouted, rushing to her side. Someone grabbed a glass of water while another relative fanned her with a napkin. The room had turned into a flurry of panic, and I was at the center of it all, trying to grasp what had just happened. "Jake," I hissed, my voice low and sharp. "What the hell is wrong with you?" He waved me off like it was no big deal, a grin still plastered on his face. "Relax, babe. It's just a joke. Lighten up." Lighten up? His mom was practically passed out. His dad was glaring at me like I'd committed a crime. And I was supposed to laugh this off. "I'm not pregnant," I finally managed to shout, my voice cracking slightly. But my denial only seemed to deepen the confusion. Jake chuckled again, shrugging as if to say, "What's the harm?" The harm was written all over his family's faces. His mom, now coming to, looked at me with teary, disbelieving eyes, like I had betrayed her trust. His dad slammed his fist on the table, making the dishes rattle. "Is this true, Jake? Or is this some kind of sick joke?" His dad growled. Jake opened his mouth to respond, but I didn't wait to hear it. All I knew was that this wasn't a joke I could stay for. The room was a storm of noise and movement. Jake's mom was slumped in her chair, her breathing shallow but steady, while his sister and an aunt hovered over her with worried expressions. Jake's dad's face was red, his hands gripping the edges of the table like he was trying to keep himself from exploding. Plates clattered as someone bumped the table in the commotion, and all I could hear was the relentless murmur of Jake's grandmother's prayers from the corner. I sat frozen, my hands gripping the napkin on my lap so tightly it began to tear. "I'm not pregnant," I repeated, louder this time, trying to cut through the chaos. But it was like no one could hear me over the pandemonium. Jake, completely unfazed, leaned back in his chair and laughed again, the sound jarring against the tension in the room. "Come on, everyone, it's just a joke. Lighten up," he said, waving his hand dismissively. His dad wasn't having it. "A joke?" he roared, glaring at Jake. "You call this a joke? Your mother almost fainted, for God's sake." I stood up, the legs of my chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice shaking, but I had no idea Jake was going to say something like that. "I am not pregnant. This is not a joke to me." Jake's grin faltered slightly, but he still shrugged, as if I was the one overreacting. "Babe, it's not that serious," he said. "Not that serious?" I repeated, my voice rising. My face burned with humiliation as I looked around the table. Everyone's eyes were on me now, and their expressions ranged from disappointment to outright anger. This wasn't just chaos, it was a disaster, and I wasn't about to stick around to clean it up. Jake's laughter was the tipping point. It cut through the noise, sharp and careless, like he was watching some comedy show instead of the emotional wreckage playing out around him. His mom was now sitting upright, her face pale and drawn, clutching a glass of water like it was the only thing tethering her to reality. His dad had fallen into a tense silence, his jaw clenched so tightly that I could see the muscle twitch. And Jake? He leaned back in his chair, completely oblivious to the hurt and chaos he'd caused. "Babe, you're overreacting," he said, still grinning. "I mean, come on, it's a family dinner. Lighten up a little, they'll get over it." "Are you serious right now?" I shot back, my voice trembling with anger. My hands were shaking, partly from humiliation, partly from sheer rage. "Your mom fainted, Jake. Your dad is ready to kill someone, and you're sitting there laughing like this is funny?" "It is funny," he insisted, rolling his eyes. "You're just too uptight to see it." The table fell silent, save for the low murmuring of Jake's grandmother, who was still clasping her rosary and whispering under her breath. His sister, who had been busy tending to their mom, looked up and gave Jake a glare that could have melted steel. "Jake, this isn't a joke," she said coldly. "What were you thinking?" "Everyone just needs to relax," Jake replied, brushing her off. "It's not like it's the end of the world." At that moment, something snapped inside me. I looked at him, at his smug, dismissive expression, and I realized that staying quiet wasn't an option anymore. I stood up, the scrape of my chair loud in the dead silence. My voice was calm, but my words came out like a knife. "Actually, Jake, the real joke is you thinking I'd stay with someone who could do this." The room froze. Jake's grin vanished as if my words had finally reached him, but I didn't wait for him to respond. I turned on my heel and walked out, leaving the wreckage of his so-called joke behind me. As I walked away from the table, the silence behind me was deafening. My heart was pounding, but I kept my head high, refusing to let anyone see just how shaky I felt. I grabbed my coat from the hallway and fumbled with the buttons, trying to steady my hands. I could hear faint whispers and the scrape of chairs from the dining room as Jake's family began to stir, but no one called after me. Not yet. The cold night air hit me like a slap when I stepped outside. I hadn't planned this. I hadn't even thought about where I would go. My car was parked down the block, and I hurried toward it, the gravel crunching beneath my shoes the only sound. The further I got from the house, the easier it became to breathe. I reached my car, leaning against the door as the adrenaline started to wear off. My hands still shook and my chest felt tight, but the initial wave of anger had dulled into something else. Exhaustion, maybe, or a deep sense of disbelief. How had the evening gone so wrong? I pulled out my phone, half expecting a flood of messages from Jake. There were none yet, but I wasn't naive enough to think that meant he wasn't furious. He'd made it abundantly clear he thought I was the one overreacting, and I had no doubt he'd double down on that when he realized I'd actually left. For a moment, I hesitated. Should I go back inside? Try to smooth things over? But then I remembered the look on his face when he laughed, the complete lack of regard for how humiliated I felt. No, going back wasn't an option. The house was still in view as I climbed into the driver's seat. Lights glowed warmly in the windows, and I could see the faint silhouettes of people moving around inside. But whatever they were saying about me didn't matter anymore. I started the car, took one last look at the house, and drove off into the night, leaving Jake and his joke in the rearview mirror. The drive home was quiet, but my mind wasn't. Thoughts raced through my head faster than the car on the empty road. Every word Jake had said replayed in a maddening loop. His smug tone, the way he'd brushed off my humiliation like it was nothing, and that ridiculous laugh. My grip on the steering wheel tightened as anger surged again, hot and sharp. By the time I reached my apartment, my phone was vibrating nonstop. Jake. I ignored the first call, then the second, letting it go straight to voicemail. I wasn't ready to hear his excuses, or, worse, his attempts to convince me that I was the problem. But he was relentless. Messages started pouring in, texts filled with everything from, "Where are you?" to, "You embarrassed me in front of my family." Embarrassed him? That was rich, considering he had just upended Thanksgiving dinner with his twisted idea of humor. I dropped my keys on the counter and slumped onto the couch, scrolling through the messages. One text stood out. "You ruined Thanksgiving. They're all mad at you now." My stomach twisted. It was one thing to be furious at Jake, but his family blaming me? That was a whole other level of infuriating. I replayed the scene in my head. His mom fainting, his dad yelling, the whole room spiraling into chaos, all because of his ridiculous stunt. How could they possibly think I was at fault? I put my phone down, resisting the urge to respond. My hand still trembled, though now it wasn't just from anger. Part of me felt guilty. Maybe I could have handled it differently. But the other part, the louder, angrier part, knew the blame didn't belong to me. The calls kept coming, but I let them ring. Tonight, Jake could yell into the void. I was done listening. The silence of my apartment felt heavy, almost suffocating. I curled up on the couch, my arms wrapped around my knees as my mind churned with everything that had just happened. The image of Jake laughing at the dinner table was seared into my brain, as if mocking me even now. His carefree grin, his dismissive shrug, it all felt like a slap in the face. I reached for my phone again, not to check his messages, but to distract myself. I opened a random app, scrolled mindlessly, but nothing could quiet the echo of his words. You ruined Thanksgiving. Ruined it? For who? His mom? Who fainted because she thought her son had just upended their traditional values? His dad, who looked ready to explode? Or his grandmother, clutching her rosary like I was some kind of sinner? And all because Jake couldn't resist the urge to turn me into the punchline of a cruel joke. A part of me wondered if I had been too harsh when I walked out. Maybe there was a better way to handle it. Maybe I shouldn't have made such a dramatic exit. But then I remembered how small I felt in that moment, with every eye at the table glaring at me, blaming me for something I didn't do. Jake's laughter still ringing in my ears, as if my humiliation was entertainment for him. No, I wasn't the one who ruined Thanksgiving. I wasn't the one who lied, who turned an intimate relationship into a spectacle. Jake had done that. I finally opened his texts again, scrolling through his frantic messages. He was alternating between blaming me and demanding that I call him back. Not a single message acknowledged his own role in the disaster. Not a single apology. Exhaustion set in, and I threw my phone aside. For the first time since the dinner, I felt a glimmer of clarity. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't overreacting. And no matter what Jake or his family thought, I didn't owe them my silence or my forgiveness. I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing incessantly on the nightstand. For a moment, I had that groggy, half-asleep hope that maybe everything was normal, that Thanksgiving hadn't been a disaster. But as I rubbed my eyes and glanced at the screen, reality set in. There were at least 20 unread messages from Jake, a mix of texts and voicemails, all time-stamped between midnight and the early hours of the morning. I didn't want to listen to his voice, so I opened the texts instead. You need to call me back. I can't believe you just left like that. Do you know how much you embarrassed me? My mom is crying and my dad is furious at you. I stared at the last message, the words burning into my brain. Furious at me? I tossed the phone down on the bed, frustration bubbling up again. How was I the villain here? Jake was the one who lied, who made a scene, who turned a family gathering into a circus. But somehow, I was the one who had to carry the blame? I sat up and reached for the glass of water I'd left on my nightstand, taking a long sip as I tried to calm down. My chest felt tight, like the weight of everyone's judgment was pressing against me. I hated conflict, and this was conflict on a massive scale. Jake's family probably saw me as some dramatic, disrespectful girlfriend who stormed out over a misunderstanding. But it wasn't a misunderstanding. It was betrayal of my trust, of my dignity. Jake hadn't even thought to ask me if I'd be okay with his so-called joke. He just sprung it on me like I was his prop, a piece in some elaborate prank to entertain his family. As I stared at my phone, I debated whether to respond. Part of me wanted to lash out, to make him understand just how cruel his actions were, but another part of me wondered if it was even worth it. Would he ever really get it? By mid-morning, the messages from Jake had shifted from frustration to outright blame. I hadn't replied, but that didn't stop him from piling on. Every text seemed to dig deeper into his warped version of what had happened the night before. You made everything worse. But they're all talking about how immature you were to leave. Why couldn't you just laugh it off? It wasn't that serious. The last one hit me hard. Was that really how he saw it? That I was overreacting to something so humiliating, so deeply disrespectful? I paced around my apartment, rereading the messages and feeling my anger rise again. His complete lack of accountability was staggering. I thought about his family and wondered what they'd been told after I left. Had Jake spun some story to make himself look better? Had he convinced them I was the one who'd ruined the evening? That I'd embarrassed him and his parents for no reason? The thought made my stomach churn. But then I stopped. Why was I letting their opinion of me matter so much? These were people I had just met. People who didn't know me, didn't understand how much Jake's joke had crossed a line. Why was I holding on to their judgment like it was some kind of verdict on my character? I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to let Jake manipulate me into feeling guilty for what had happened. I hadn't caused the chaos at that dinner table. I hadn't fainted or yelled or made the entire evening about a ridiculous lie. That was on him. For the first time since leaving his family's house, I felt a spark of resolve. I wasn't going to apologize for protecting myself. If Jake thought otherwise, that was his problem, not mine. Just as I was starting to feel a flicker of confidence, the next wave of messages came in. Not from Jake this time, but from his family. I hadn't expected them to contact me directly, and when I saw the unfamiliar numbers lighting up my phone, I hesitated before opening the texts. The first one was from his sister. "Hi, I don't know why you left like that last night, but Mom's really upset. She thinks you owe her an apology." An apology? My heart sank as I read it, but before I could even process, another message buzzed in. This one was from an aunt whose name I barely remembered. "I hope you realize how much you hurt Jake and his parents. They're such good people, and you didn't even try to fix things." Fix things? My jaw tightened. How was this suddenly my responsibility? Each message that came in only added to the weight on my chest. Jake's family clearly saw me as the problem, the dramatic girlfriend who couldn't take a joke and stormed off without a second thought. I replayed the scene in my head for the 100th time. Jake's mom fainting, his dad yelling, the awkward silence that followed my exit. Maybe they didn't know the full story. Maybe Jake had already spun his version of events, framing me as unreasonable. Or maybe they just couldn't face the truth that Jake was the one who created the entire mess. For a moment, I considered responding, trying to explain my side of things. But then I stopped myself. What good would it do? These people had already made up their minds. They'd known Jake his whole life and me for one chaotic evening. Of course, they were going to side with him. Instead of answering, I turned off my phone and threw it onto the couch. Let them think what they wanted. I wasn't going to waste my energy defending myself to people who had no interest in hearing the truth. For the first time that day, I felt a sliver of peace. I didn't need their approval, and I certainly didn't need their judgment. With my phone off and the world temporarily muted, the quiet of my apartment became almost unbearable. I paced the small living room, my thoughts spinning in circles. It wasn't just Jake now, it was his entire family. Their messages, their accusations, their insistence that I was the problem. It all weighed heavily on me. No matter how much I told myself their opinions didn't matter. I thought back to the dinner, trying to pinpoint the exact moment everything went so horribly wrong. Maybe if I'd laughed off Jake's joke, things would have settled down. Maybe if I'd stayed at the table instead of leaving, I could have smoothed things over. But every time I entertained those thoughts, the memory of his laughter brought the same wave of anger crashing back. This wasn't on me. I wasn't the one who lied. I wasn't the one who humiliated someone I supposedly cared about in front of a dozen strangers. And yet, here I was, sitting alone, carrying all the fallout from Jake's actions. I grabbed a blanket and curled up on the couch, trying to shake the feeling of isolation that was creeping in. It wasn't just physical isolation. It was the kind that settled deep in your bones, the kind that made you feel like no one was truly on your side. I considered reaching out to a friend, someone who might understand or at least distract me, but I hesitated. I hated dragging people into my problems, especially when it all felt so messy and personal. Instead, I sat there, letting the silence stretch out around me. The anger was still there, but now it was mixed with something heavier, something I didn't want to name just yet. All I could do was sit with it, waiting for the storm in my head to settle. By the time the afternoon rolled around, the silence in my apartment was unbearable. I hadn't turned my phone back on, but the weight of everything, the messages, the blame, the accusations, was suffocating. I needed to talk to someone who would understand, someone who could help me make sense of the whirlwind that had become my life. I grabbed my laptop and opened a group chat with my closest friends. Typing the first message felt awkward, like I was unloading too much all at once, but I reminded myself that this was what friends were for. So Jake told his family I was pregnant last night, as a joke. His mom fainted, and it was a total disaster. Then I walked out. Now his family is blaming me. I don't even know what to do anymore. Within seconds, the replies started flooding in. Wait, what? He did what? Girl, tell us everything. Their responses brought a small, fleeting smile to my face. At least someone was on my side. I spent the next half hour explaining the whole story. Jake's announcement, his mom's reaction, his laughter, and the way his family had turned on me afterward. By the time I finished, the chat was blowing up with messages. That's not a joke. That's emotional terrorism. You did the right thing walking out. He's trying to gaslight you into thinking this is your fault. It's not. Their words were like a balm on an open wound. For the first time since the dinner, I felt less alone, like I wasn't completely crazy for thinking Jake had crossed a massive line. One friend, Sarah, suggested we meet up for coffee to talk in person. You need a break from this mess, she said, and I couldn't have agreed more. I closed the laptop, feeling a little lighter. Jake's family might have been against me, but my friends were firmly in my corner. And right now, that was enough to keep me grounded. Later that evening, I turned my phone back on, bracing for the flood of notifications I knew would be waiting. As expected, more texts from Jake and a few follow-ups from his family lit up my screen. But what caught my eye was a message from Sarah, sent after our chat earlier. Do you think he's always been like this, or is this new? Her question stopped me in my tracks. I hadn't thought about it before, but now it felt like a spotlight was shining on every moment Jake and I had shared over the past year. Was this cruel sense of humor something I'd ignored before? Or was it the first time he'd gone so far? I started replaying past interactions, trying to piece it together. There had been other jokes, of course, little things he'd said or done that made me uncomfortable but didn't seem worth fighting over. Like the time he teased me in front of his friends about how long I took to get ready, or the time he exaggerated a harmless argument we'd had, making me sound irrational. He always brushed it off with a laugh, saying, "Don't be so sensitive." At the time, I'd written it off as part of his personality. He was playful, a little immature, but nothing I thought I couldn't handle. Now, in hindsight, those moments didn't feel so harmless anymore. Jake's joke at Thanksgiving wasn't an isolated incident. It was the culmination of a pattern I had been too willing to overlook. He didn't see boundaries the same way I did. To him, my feelings were something to poke fun at, a tool for his entertainment. That realization hit harder than I expected. This wasn't just about a single disastrous dinner. It was about something deeper, something I couldn't ignore anymore. The next day, I met Sarah at our favorite coffee shop. The warm scent of espresso and cinnamon filled the air as we settled into a corner booth, far away from the bustle of the counter. She looked at me with a mix of concern and determination, her hands wrapped around her mug as if she was preparing for battle on my behalf. "All right," she said, cutting straight to the point. "Start from the beginning," I sighed, recounting the events of Thanksgiving in detail. Sarah listened intently, nodding occasionally, but mostly letting me unload without interruption. I told her about the dinner, Jake's announcement, his laughter, his family's reaction, and how everything spiraled from there. When I finished, she sat back, her expression a mix of disbelief and anger. That's not just a bad joke. I don't even know what to call it. Manipulative? Cruel? What was he even trying to accomplish? I shook my head. I have no idea. He said it was just to lighten the mood or something. But how is lying about a pregnancy supposed to be funny, especially with his family being so traditional? Sarah leaned forward, her voice low but firm. This isn't just about the joke. It's about how he treated you afterward. He didn't care how it made you feel. He didn't even try to apologize. He blamed you for everything. Her words struck a chord. I had been so focused on the embarrassment and chaos that I hadn't fully processed Jake's complete lack of remorse. "I don't know," I said finally, stirring my coffee absent-mindedly. "Maybe I overreacted. I could have just laughed it off and dealt with it later." "No," Sarah said sharply. "Don't do that. Don't minimize what happened. You stood up for yourself, and you were right to walk away." Hearing her say that felt like a weight lifting off my chest. For the first time, I began to see my actions not as dramatic, but as necessary. Maybe walking out wasn't just an act of anger, it was an act of self-respect. And that, Sarah reminded me, was something I should never apologize for. Later that evening, after my talk with Sarah, I checked my phone again. The notifications hadn't stopped. Jake was still relentless, alternating between guilt-tripping me and doubling down on his stance that I was the one who ruined everything. The messages were exhausting to read. "You overreacted, and now my mom is devastated. This was supposed to be a fun night. You took it way too seriously. You embarrassed me in front of my whole family. Do you even care how I feel?" Each text felt like a jab, poking at the parts of me that already felt raw and vulnerable. His words were designed to make me doubt myself, to make me question whether I had overreacted. For a moment, I felt the familiar pull of guilt creeping in. Was I really the bad guy here? But then I stopped myself. I thought about everything Sarah had said, about the way Jake had laughed at my discomfort and then blamed me for leaving. His messages weren't apologies. They were attempts to shift the responsibility onto me. I decided to respond, but this time I was clear and firm. "Jake, I'm not going to argue with you. What you did wasn't funny. It was humiliating, and the fact that you can't see that is a huge problem. If you care about how I feel, you'd stop trying to make this my fault." I hit send and stared at the screen, half expecting an immediate reply. But for the first time in hours, there was silence. I felt a strange mix of relief and anxiety. Standing up for myself felt empowering, but I knew it wasn't the end. Jake wouldn't let this go so easily. Still, I wasn't backing down. For the first time since Thanksgiving, I felt like I had regained a little bit of control. Whatever happened next, I wasn't going to let him manipulate me into feeling like I owed him anything. Not an apology, not my silence, and certainly not my forgiveness. After sending that message to Jake, I sat on my couch, phone in hand, waiting for some kind of response. None came. The silence was eerie, almost unsettling, but it gave me space to think. A luxury I hadn't had since Thanksgiving exploded into chaos. I began replaying the past year in my head, scrutinizing moments I'd glossed over at the time. Jake had always been confident, charming, and fun to be around. But now I wondered if I'd mistaken those qualities for something deeper. The same humor that had drawn me to him was now revealing cracks in the foundation of our relationship. There had been other incidents, smaller than this one, but they carried the same thread. Like the time he made fun of the way I ordered food on a date, mimicking me to get a laugh from the server. Or when he told his friends I'd cried during a movie, turning a private moment into a punchline. I'd brushed those off as quirks, chalking them up to his playful nature. But now, in the wake of this disaster, those moments didn't feel harmless anymore. They felt calculated, designed to put me in a vulnerable position while he enjoyed the spotlight. I started to wonder if I had ignored warning signs because I wanted the relationship to work. Jake wasn't all bad. He could be sweet and attentive when he wanted to be. But those moments didn't erase what had happened. The truth was becoming harder to ignore. Jake's idea of a joke often came at my expense. And this time, he had gone too far. For the first time, I let myself consider a future without him. The thought was both terrifying and strangely freeing. Maybe it was time to stop excusing the inexcusable. As I reflected on Jake's actions, I couldn't help but think about his family and the part they played in all of this. Their reaction during and after the dinner was burned into my memory. His mom fainting, his dad yelling, his grandmother whispering prayers like I was some sort of moral catastrophe. And now, their texts blaming me for the entire fiasco. I tried to put myself in their shoes. If I were a parent, hearing my son announce an unexpected pregnancy, I'd probably be shocked too, maybe even upset. But the sheer intensity of their reaction, fainting, accusations, anger, felt like it came from something deeper than just surprise. Jake had warned me before the dinner that his family was super traditional, but I hadn't understood just how rigid they were. The moment he made that announcement, it was like a switch flipped. I wasn't just Jake's girlfriend anymore. I was suddenly a symbol of everything they didn't approve of. Pregnant out of wedlock, disrupting their perfect family image, ruining their carefully curated Thanksgiving dinner. But what struck me most was how easily they turned on me without questioning Jake's role in it all. It was his lie, his joke, yet I was the one they blamed. It made me wonder if Jake's lack of accountability was something he'd learned at home. Maybe he'd grown up watching people like his dad deflect blame or his mom focus on appearances over reality. It wasn't an excuse for his behavior, but it helped me see the bigger picture. Jake's immaturity didn't come out of nowhere. It was shaped by the environment he grew up in. And while I could empathize with that, it didn't make me responsible for fixing it. As much as I wanted to believe his family's opinions of me didn't matter, their influence on Jake was undeniable. They had raised him to see the world a certain way, and that worldview was now colliding with my own. I realized then that even if I stayed with Jake, this dynamic with his family would always be a part of the equation, and that was a reality I wasn't sure I could live with. The next day, I woke up feeling clearer about what I needed to do. It wasn't just about Jake anymore. It was about reclaiming control of my life and setting boundaries with people who thought they could dictate how I should feel or act. For too long, I had allowed Jake's behavior, and now his family's, to chip away at my sense of self. That had to stop. I started with his family. I reopened the string of accusatory messages they'd sent me and resisted the urge to respond defensively. Instead, I wrote a short, direct message to the group of relatives who had reached out. I understand that last night was upsetting, but I want to make it clear that Jake's announcement was not discussed with me beforehand. It was not something I agreed to, nor did I find it appropriate. I'm sorry the evening was disrupted, but I won't take responsibility for something I had no control over. I hit send and felt a wave of relief. I wasn't looking for their forgiveness or approval. I just needed to make my position clear. If they still chose to see me as the problem, that was on them, not me. Next, I turned my attention to Jake. I knew he'd call again, so I decided to cut off the back and forth once and for all. When his name lit up my screen, I picked up, keeping my voice steady. "Jake," I said before he could launch into another tirade. "I've made my decision. What you did wasn't okay, and the way you handled it afterward made it worse. I need time to think about whether this relationship is healthy for me. For now, I don't want to talk. Please respect that." He tried to argue, his voice rising with frustration, but I didn't engage. "I'll reach out when I'm ready," I said firmly, then hung up. The silence that followed was empowering. For the first time, I felt like I had drawn a line. Not just with Jake, but with everyone involved. And this time, I wasn't stepping back over it. After drawing those boundaries with Jake and his family, I braced myself for the ripple effects. It didn't take long for them to appear. Mutual friends started reaching out, some wanting to know what really happened, while others hinted that Jake had already shared his side of the story. One message in particular stood out. "Hey, Jake said you left Thanksgiving over a dumb joke? He's really upset. Are you guys okay?" A dumb joke. That's how he was framing it. Not the humiliation, not the chaos, not the blame he'd shifted onto me. Just a harmless prank that I supposedly overreacted to. The narrative was clear. I was the dramatic girlfriend who couldn't take a joke and stormed off, leaving everyone to deal with the aftermath. It stung to know people might actually believe that. But instead of rushing to defend myself, I decided to let it go. The people who truly knew me wouldn't buy into Jake's version of events, and the ones who did, they weren't worth my energy. My own family, on the other hand, was a different story. When I told my mom what had happened, she was livid. Not at me, but at Jake. "That's not a joke," she said, her voice sharp. "That's disrespectful. You deserve better." Hearing her say that gave me a sense of validation I didn't know I needed. She reminded me that standing up for myself wasn't just about this one incident. It was about setting a precedent for how I expected to be treated in all areas of my life. Some friends chimed in with similar support, telling me they admired how I'd handled the situation. It felt good to know that, even as Jake and his family tried to paint me as the villain, I wasn't alone. For the first time, I began to see this ordeal not as a failure, but as a turning point, one that might finally lead me toward something better. A few days later, Jake reached out again. This time, instead of his usual barrage of angry texts, he sent a carefully worded message asking to talk. "I've been thinking about everything. Can we meet up? I just want to make things right." I stared at the screen, conflicted. Part of me wanted to ignore him completely, but another part, the part that still cared despite everything, felt like I owed it to myself to hear him out. I agreed to meet him at a neutral spot, a park near my apartment. When I arrived, Jake was already there, pacing near a bench. He looked nervous, which was unusual for him. His confident, easygoing demeanor had been replaced by something more subdued. "Thanks for meeting me," he said as I approached. I really need to apologize." For a moment, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe he had finally realized how hurtful his actions had been. "I messed up," he continued, looking down at his hands. "I shouldn't have joked like that. I thought it would be funny, but I see now that it wasn't. It was stupid, and I'm sorry." His words were what I'd been waiting to hear, but something about his tone felt off. It was flat, almost rehearsed, like he was saying the things he thought I wanted to hear, rather than genuinely understanding the damage he'd caused. "And the way you walked out," he added quickly, "I didn't handle that well either. I was just embarrassed in front of my family, and I took it out on you. I shouldn't have done that." I nodded, letting him finish, but the pit in my stomach grew. Even in his apology, there was an undertone of self-pity, a subtle attempt to make me feel responsible for his embarrassment. "Jake," I said carefully, "I appreciate you apologizing, but I need more than words. I need to know that you actually understand why this hurt me so much." His expression faltered, and I realized he didn't. Not fully. And that realization hurt more than any of the messages, fights, or chaos that had come before. Sitting across from Jake, I realized this was the moment everything would hinge on. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "Jake," I began, "it's not just about the joke. It's about how you didn't think about me at all in that moment. You didn't ask how I'd feel, and then you blamed me when things went wrong." He frowned, leaning forward. "I've already said I'm sorry. What more do you want me to do?" It wasn't an unreasonable question, but it was also the wrong one. "I want you to understand," I said quietly. "This wasn't just a bad joke. It was humiliating. It made me feel like I was a prop in your performance, not someone you actually respect." Jake's shoulders slumped, but instead of responding, he shook his head. "I didn't mean to humiliate you," he muttered, as if that excused everything. "But you did," I said firmly. "And then you laughed about it, like my feelings didn't matter. Do you even understand why I walked out?" His silence was telling. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, as if he couldn't find the right words. Finally, he said, "I just thought, I don't know, that you'd roll with it, that you'd laugh too." I felt a pang of sadness as I realized how little he understood me, or how little he cared to. "Jake, this isn't just about Thanksgiving. This is about the way you see me, the way you've handled things before, and the way you've treated me since. I can't keep doing this." His face fell, the realization hitting him all at once. "You're breaking up with me," he said flatly. I nodded, tears pricking at the corners of my eyes despite my resolve. "I have to, Jake. I deserve to be with someone who listens, who respects me, who doesn't turn me into a punchline." He sat back, stunned into silence. I stood, my heart heavy but certain, and walked away. This time, I wasn't looking back. The walk away from Jake felt heavier than I'd anticipated. My steps were slow, my mind replaying the conversation over and over, searching for signs that I might have been too harsh or too quick to make my decision. But every time doubt crept in, I reminded myself of one simple truth. Staying with Jake would mean continuing to ignore my own boundaries, and I couldn't do that anymore. When I got home, I let myself cry. It wasn't the wailing, dramatic sobs you see in movies, just quiet tears that felt more like a release than grief. A part of me still loved Jake, or at least the version of him I'd hoped he could be. Letting go of that hope hurt, but it also felt like I was making space for something healthier. I checked my phone, half expecting another flood of messages, but there were none. Jake must have understood that I needed space, or maybe he was too stunned to say anything else. Either way, the silence felt like confirmation that I'd made the right call. I texted Sarah to let her know how the conversation had gone. Her reply came almost immediately. "Proud of you. Call me if you want to talk." Her words felt like a lifeline. I called her and we spent the next hour talking about everything. Jake, his family, the relationship, and what I wanted for my future. By the time we hung up, I felt lighter. Ending things with Jake wasn't just about him. It was about choosing myself, about valuing my feelings and my dignity enough to walk away from someone who didn't. For the first time in days, I felt a sense of peace. The relationship was over, but my life wasn't. In fact, it was just beginning. The next morning, I woke up to a strange sensation: peace. The weight that had been pressing on me since Thanksgiving was gone, replaced by a quiet calm. It wasn't that everything felt perfect. There was still a lingering sadness over how things had ended with Jake, but it was accompanied by a sense of relief. For the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe without second-guessing myself. I didn't have to brace for another accusatory text or prepare to defend my actions. The decision had been made, and it was final. I spent the day cleaning my apartment, a task I hadn't had the energy for in the midst of all the drama. It felt symbolic, clearing away the clutter, both physical and emotional. As I folded laundry and wiped down countertops, I thought about what life without Jake would look like. It wasn't just the absence of his laughter or his presence in my daily routine. It was the absence of his dismissiveness, his inability to take my feelings seriously. For so long, I had accepted his teasing, his excuses, his refusal to acknowledge when he hurt me, because I thought that was just part of being in a relationship. Now, I saw how wrong that was. The quiet gave me room to reflect on what I wanted moving forward. I thought about the kind of partner I deserved. Someone who listened, who cared about how their actions affected me, who didn't treat me like the punchline of their jokes. And I thought about how I could be that person for myself first. By the time evening rolled around, I felt lighter than I had in weeks. I curled up on the couch with a blanket and a book, the simple pleasure of it reminding me that life goes on. The drama of Thanksgiving was behind me now, and so was Jake. The chaos had passed, and in its place was the quiet realization that I was going to be okay. More than okay. I was finally free to focus on myself, and that was a gift I hadn't expected to find. As the days turned into a week, the storm of emotions began to settle, leaving me with something I hadn't felt in a long time: clarity. The events of Thanksgiving, as messy and humiliating as they were, had forced me to confront things about myself and my relationship that I might have otherwise ignored. First, I realized the importance of boundaries. Real, non-negotiable boundaries that protect my sense of self. For too long, I had allowed Jake to chip away at those boundaries with his jokes and dismissive attitude. His behavior on Thanksgiving wasn't an isolated incident. It was the culmination of a pattern I had chosen to overlook. That realization stung, but it also empowered me. I could no longer blame Jake alone. I had to take responsibility for allowing those boundaries to be crossed in the first place. Second, I learned that respect is non-negotiable. A relationship without mutual respect isn't a relationship. It's a performance. And I had been playing a role that didn't serve me. Jake might not have meant to hurt me, but his intentions didn't erase the impact of his actions. Respect isn't about intentions. It's about awareness and care for how your words and actions affect someone else. Finally, I learned the value of choosing myself. Walking away from Jake wasn't easy, but it was necessary. For the first time, I prioritized my dignity and self-respect over the fear of being alone, and that decision felt like reclaiming a part of myself I didn't realize I had lost. In the end, Thanksgiving had become more than a disastrous dinner. It was a turning point. It forced me to see not just who Jake was, but who I wanted to be, and the kind of relationships I wanted to cultivate moving forward. I wasn't angry anymore, and I wasn't bitter. Instead, I felt grateful for the clarity that chaos had brought. This wasn't the ending I had envisioned, but it was the beginning of something better. And for that, I was thankful. As I sat down to reflect on everything, I realized that this experience wasn't just about Jake, his family, or even Thanksgiving. It was about learning to trust myself, to listen to that voice inside me that said, "This isn't okay," and act on it. Looking back, I could see how easy it was to fall into the trap of excusing behavior that hurt me, brushing it off as not that bad or just how he is. But what I've come to understand is that we teach people how to treat us by what we tolerate. And if we don't stand up for ourselves, no one else will. I wanted to share my story because I know I'm not the only one who has struggled with this. How many of us have stayed silent when someone crossed a line, just to keep the peace? How many of us have doubted ourselves, thinking we were overreacting when deep down, we knew we deserved better? If there's one thing I've learned, it's that standing up for yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary. It's not about being perfect or always having the right response in the moment. It's about recognizing your worth and refusing to let anyone, no matter how much you care about them, make you feel small or unimportant. Walking away from Jake was hard. Setting boundaries with his family was hard. But those decisions gave me something I couldn't have found any other way: freedom. Freedom to prioritize my happiness, my peace, and my future. To anyone reading this who's struggling with a similar situation, trust yourself. Your feelings are valid, your boundaries matter, and you deserve to be treated with respect. Don't be afraid to choose yourself. I promise, it's worth it. And as for me, I'm moving forward, stronger and more certain of who I am than ever before.